My dear friends and budding historians, today's lecture is on the Russian Revolution. And when I was an undergraduate student, as a history student, Russia was my specialty. So this is one of my favorite topics to speak about. If you are in my global history class, you're going to want to grab those PowerPoint slides and kind of follow along as I talk you through a very broad general overview about the Russian Revolution. Now, the revolution happened in 1917. This was toward the end of World War I, and very often the revolution is seen as coming out of World War I, and it's usually taught sort of while you teach World War I or sometimes after World War I. But for our global history class, I think it's interesting to think about the Russian Revolution as emerging from the Industrial Revolution and actually being part of the story of industrialization. So just as I suggested to you that the so-called new imperialism was really an extension of the Second Industrial Revolution, in the same vein, I'm going to suggest to you that the Russian Revolution is part of the story of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so just to review Russia and what was going on in Russia in the days before, in the 19th century. In the 1800s, at least the first half of the 1800s, Russia still had serfdom. So serfdom means when a person, a serf, who is a peasant who farms the land, is tied to the land and they're not free to do something different. They're not free to move elsewhere. They're not necessarily free to do something different with their lives, such as become a trader or an artisan. They have to talk to their lord about whether they can do that or not. So this is a very old system. Serfdom was something that was around in the medieval days in Western Europe. It was around in England in like the 1200s, the 1300s, just to give you a sense of what I spoke about the last time we talked about Russia. Russia is on a different timeline than the rest of Europe. Something that is mentioned on your PowerPoint slides is that Russia in the 1800s had extensive anti-Semitism, and there were not just feelings of anti-Semitism, but acts of anti-Semitism called pogroms, where people would violently attack Jewish communities. The state was an autocratic state ruled by the monarch called the Tsar. And so, again, we see some inklings here that Russia is looking a little more like the Ottoman Empire in the same time period. It also looks a little bit like the Qing dynasty of China in the same time period. It's agrarian. It's ruled by an autocrat. And it's not developing on the same trajectory as England and France and even toward the end of the 1800s Germany. Okay, Russia realizes they're not on the trajectory they want. They see that they're failing in the Crimean War. They're seeing that other countries are outproducing them in terms of industrial output. So they start to build railroads. They're on the path. But by 1917, Russia is still way behind the Western states, the U.S. There's many attempts to reform. One of the first was a popular uprising of a sort of semi-elite liberal class who wanted liberal reforms. This was way back in 1825. And it was put down quite ruthlessly. The people involved were exiled to Siberia. The outcome of this Decembrist uprising was that the Tsar at the time felt it was necessary to react very strongly against any reform whatsoever. So it was what's sometimes called a reactionary attitude, that everything had to be just completely stopped. no reforms, no changes. It was a sort of reaction of fear, right? Rather than trying to integrate a few changes here and there, it was just stamp it out, stamp it out. Okay. Even so, there was a reforming Tsar later on in the 1860s and 70s. His name was Tsar Alexander II. He's most well known in Russia because he ended serfdom. So he really wanted to bring Russia into the 19th century, bring it up to what France and England were doing. So he ended serfdom, he freed the serfs, and for his troubles, he was assassinated. This was 20 years later in 1881. The same Tsar was assassinated because some people felt the changes weren't happening fast enough. And his son, who was also named Alexander, his son saw all of this, and to put it very simply, what he learned from this was that it wasn't good to be a reforming Tsar because they'll kill you anyway. So he felt a very, again, kind of a fear-based feeling that people would come and attack him and kill him if he tried to repeat what his father, Tsar Alexander II, did. So Alexander III was very reactionary, very conservative. Over this whole time period of the late 1800s, people are starting to read and learn about the idea of Marx. And there's a whole bunch of different people who want to change Russia. Some are more interested in like the liberal reforms, and they want the country to be more like England. But let's focus about the people who were interested in Marx. One group was the Socialist Revolutionary Party. And this was a party that wanted to have a kind of a socialist revolution that mixed an agrarian kind of socialism, okay, with the Marxist socialism of workers. The reason why they wanted to do this was that Russia was not fully industrialized. Russia wasn't even halfway industrialized. So there was no sense in the SR's mind to have a revolution of workers. There weren't enough workers. Most people were still peasants. I gave you a little picture there of Paul Michael Glasser from the film Fiddler on the Roof. They don't specifically say that his character is a socialist revolutionary. Not that I remember, but I think he is because of his interest to go into the village and speak to the people in Fiddler on the Roof who are all peasants in a rural village. So they're really interested in kind of the rural people, the population of Russia. That's a musical, so it's a fictional film, so it's in no way a documentary. So you have to take it with a grain of salt, but it does kind of give you a picture of some of the things happening in Russia in the late 1800s. Another group that was more interested in a full Marxist program that was focused on workers, it was focused on people who worked in factories, was the SDs, the Social Democrats. And this party eventually transforms into two different groups, a Bolshevik party of Marxists and a Menshevik party of Marxists. The Bolsheviks felt that only a fast, brutal revolution would work in Russia, whereas the Mensheviks were interested in working within the system to change it gradually. So the Mensheviks were interested in kind of working with what was there, with becoming involved in politics and changing things gradually. You'll remember when we spoke about Japan last week that Japan and Russia fought a war in 1904, and Russia lost very badly to Japan. And the whole situation was taken as a real fiasco. It wasn't just any loss, it was felt to be a real fiasco, a real failing of Russia. This feeling of unrest that the system was not working led a group of protesters to meet up and to stage a protest outside of the Tsar's palace. These protesters weren't trying to overthrow the Tsar. It's said that the protesters were singing "God Save the Tsar." They were led by a priest. So again, that's not necessarily a revolutionary figure. That's a traditional figure, right? But they, despite all of this, they were mowed down by the Tsar's guards. They were massacred in an event called Bloody Sunday. Russians heard about this, and it was an immediate uprising. The uprising was eventually quelled, but the important point to take away from this was that the Tsar established the first real parliament of Russia, called the Duma, and that's from the word to think. The Duma means sort of the place where people think. Okay, so we see a pattern here of attempts at reform, repression, attempts at reform, repression, and you might compare that to the Ottoman Empire and also the Chinese Empire at this time. And there's some important differences as well. I'll let you come to those on your own. We also saw in 1904-05 that when Russia was doing badly in war, that could spell real problems of discontent at home. So we're going to see a repetition of this on a grander scale during the First World War. It's the First World War we'll speak about more next week. But for our purposes today, you need to know that the war started in 1914. Russia was fighting Germany and Austria-Hungary. Russia was doing horribly in the war. There was one country that was maybe doing a little bit worse, which was Austria-Hungary. So what would happen is that the Russians would kind of beat the Austro-Hungarians every winter, and then every summer the Germans would come in and beat back Russia. The Russians were very badly equipped, very badly trained. It's said that soldiers were brought to the front lines, and sent in without full equipment, and were told to simply pick up equipment, to pick up a gun from a fallen comrade that they would find. Okay, and again, that connects back to Russia's late start in industrialization, because they're not making the equipment and the machinery and the guns at a high enough rate to combat a fully industrialized country like Germany. People are so upset at what's going on that they protest, they march, and at a certain point in February by the Russian calendar, technically it was March on the Western calendar. I told you Russia's always behind the West, even with that. The women marching on Women's Day, it kind of gets out of control, and spontaneously things just start devolving. Everyone's protesting. It's like riots, things like that. It gets way out of control. People are just overrunning government buildings. People in the militias or the soldiers are refusing to do their job and keep order, right? They're joining in with the crowds. It reaches to the point where the Tsar steps down and relinquishes his power, and a provisional government is put in its place. Problem with all of this is that the provisional government wasn't really well thought out. They were kind of just making things up in a very ad hoc manner. So there was another group called the Soviets, which a Soviet was like a group of representatives from different workers' organizations. So Soviet means to advise, right? So this was an advisory group. So that's what the word Soviet comes from. So it's like a little, a little kind of governmental association, but that the Soviets were from working organizations or from Marxist political organizations. Meanwhile, the provisional government is kind of a hodgepodge of whoever was left over from the Duma, some SRs, some other people thrown in there. Okay, the provisional government is not getting anything done. They're not able to run the country, and perhaps most importantly, the provisional government does not end the war that kind of really started all of these uprisings, right? So you can see in the timeline that things kind of just evolve. In April, Lenin gets back to Russia. He had been in exile. He returns. He gives a big speech. He calls for peace, land, and bread, and he says, all power to the Soviets. What he means by all power to the Soviets is he's saying, forget the provisional government. Let's have the Soviets take charge. Okay. There's a few more episodes that happen, including an attempted military coup. So it's just generally chaos all through the summer. Things reach a head in October. Okay, that whole February Revolution just didn't pan out. It's like they cut off the head of the organization and they didn't put a new one in there. So what happens is the Bolsheviks decide to just step in. Remember that all power to the Soviets thing? They're like, let's just take it. So they step in and just take over key institutions. They step in and take over the post office, for example. And once they get enough of that going on, Lenin orders the arrest of the entire provisional government. They seize the Winter Palace, which was kind of like, that would be like seizing our Capitol building or our White House. And that's it. That's the October Revolution. You can see this is a very small group of people who actually organized this so-called revolution. So I would suggest to you that the October Revolution was really more of a coup d'etat than a popular uprising like February. Okay, something important to know is at this point the Bolsheviks start to enter into peace talks with Germany. Okay, immediately. They know the war is the number one problem. Let's get that taken care of first. So they enter into peace talks. Their allies go nuts with this. They're very upset, and we'll talk more about that next week with World War I. Okay. Although the Soviets have seized power and they're able to organize themselves and actually run things in a kind of an efficient way, that doesn't mean that everyone agreed with this by any stretch of the imagination. There was immediately a civil war, a really horrible civil war. I suppose they all are. The Russian Civil War lasted for about 5 years. There's two groups. There's the Red Army, which is the Marxists, the Bolsheviks, the Communists. That's the Red Army. And then there's a White Army, which the White Army is actually kind of a hodgepodge of anyone who doesn't like the Reds. So there's, small-time farmers. There's people who are still very dedicated to the Orthodox religion, so they don't like the Reds for that. There's wealthy people. There's people from the old armed forces in the White Army. And then there's a bunch of Westerners in the White Army who were sent there from France and England and the United States who are also there fighting. Okay, the Red Army was led by a man named Leon Trotsky. So our leaders in this situation are Vladimir Lenin, who's kind of the head of the Bolshevik party. So that's the bald dude. So he's numero uno. Lenin's numero uno. Trotsky is second in command. So Trotsky will be the man with the glasses always. Trotsky was a really intellectual, a voracious intellectual who was interested in everything he read and able to amass information very quickly. He had no military experience whatsoever, but Lenin placed him in charge of the Red Army, and what Trotsky did is he studied. And he was the type of person who could read everything that had been written about military strategy and understand it and translate it back into a winning formula. And incredibly, the Red Army, despite the fact that Trotsky had no previous experience, despite the fact that they were surrounded by all kinds of different enemies from different walks of life, the Red Army was ultimately victorious. Not only victorious in Russia, but they also managed to gain back all of their satellite countries they had lost to Germany. Not all of them. They were not able to gain back Poland or the Baltic states or Finland at this time in 1922. But they're able to get a hold of Belarus, Ukraine, and kick out the whites. Okay. During the Civil War, there's a pretty kind of oppressive climate where there's economically something called war communism, which is kind of like a war situation where there's no free markets, things are rationed, you kind of, it's a war, right? You can't get everything you need, you have to do what the authorities say. There's also a secret police created called the Cheka. However, once the Civil War is firmly ended and the Soviets are in control, Lenin does something that kind of surprised a lot of people at the time. He announced a brand new economic policy called NEP or NEP, New Economic Policy. And the policy, to state it simply, was just capitalism. That was the policy. It's very strange. Why would he do that? Because Lenin really believed in Marx. He really believed in Marx's ideas through and through. And Marx's idea was that first you're an agrarian society, then you need a capitalist industrial society, and only after that capitalism works its way through, only after that, then you can have a revolution of proletariat workers. You see, he felt that Russia was never going to get to that ideal Marxist state, a dictatorship of the proletariat, because they had skipped a step. They still needed to industrialize. Okay, so anyway, there's NEP, the New Economic Policy. At the time, that was the policy. People, there was no timeline on it. People were like, oh, I guess this is what we're doing now. That's not so bad. You know, so there was a kind of a really nice growth in the economy, given the backward state of things and the devastations of two back-to-back wars. But then in 1924, Lenin suffers a series of strokes. And at this time, Stalin takes control. All right, so we had Lenin, the bald dude, Trotsky, the intellectual with the glasses, and then the third man, Stalin, the man of steel. So that's the guy with the big mustache. He's pretty prominent in the party, but he's never even close to being something like at Trotsky's level. Trotsky was the heir apparent. But Stalin was so smart that he very slowly targeted his rivals one by one to get them out of power, including even Trotsky. Once Trotsky is gone, Stalin is undisputed leader of what has become called the Soviet Union, the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics. So we'll end with a little bit now about the 30s and Stalin. I know what you're thinking. I thought this lecture was about the Russian Revolution in 1917. Now we're all the way to the 30s. When did this revolution end? Well, it depends on your definition of what a revolution is, and it depends on your definition of what the Russian Revolution was all about. But I will say, by their own way of speaking about it, the revolution wasn't over until they had achieved that Marxist proletariat paradise. So you see, during the time of Stalin, it was still said we are still undergoing the revolution. We're still working toward where we need to be. So by their own way of speaking, the revolution was still going on. Let's talk about Stalin, the man of steel. That was the name he took on, man of steel. He is from Georgia, which means that he is in a minority group, a national minority group. His background was that he had originally studied for life in the clergy as a churchman. When he takes power, he scraps Lenin's new economic policy and replaces it with his first 5-year plan. And so this is a very different policy, which kind of suggests that Dnieper was complete and that capitalist stage was over and that they were ready to jump right into that workers' paradise. It was successful in some ways because Russia was able in that 5 years to greatly increase their industrial output. They founded new factories, they founded new cities, as you can see the picture there of Magnitogorsk, the socialist city of steel. That became the world's largest steel production facility. So that really showed that Stalin, that man of steel, could push things through and get this industrialization done without waiting for the natural capitalism. You could just use the state to go in there, build the factory, bring the people into work there. In terms of food production, the farms were collectivized. So all private farms were seized and turned into one gigantic farm. So again, we have very gigantic farms today very frequently. So it's kind of similar. It was a different path toward that huge kind of agro business, that industrial scale farm for the big production. A lot of people resisted this. They didn't want to work on a collective farm. They liked the old way things were. Maybe they had their own farm, particularly in Russia's bread belt, which is Ukraine. Ukraine was the bread basket for the entire region. A lot of people resisted Stalin's plan, and so Stalin implemented some policies to try to crush that resistance and make the people bow to his will. His policies were things like sealing the borders of the country, requisitioning the grain out of Ukraine, not letting other food products in, and it resulted in the Holodomor. Forgive me if my pronunciation's off there. This was a famine. At least 5 million Ukrainians died in this famine. So probably more. So we see right away when we think of Stalin as one of the most horrendous killers of the 20th century, this is the types of things that were going on under Stalin. He's also perhaps even more famously known for the terror. The terror was in the later 1930s, the terror got started, and it was a persecution of any kind of political enemy, real or perceived. And the Great Purges was a terror against people within the party. So this is a purge of people who weren't sufficiently revolutionary within the party or within the elite. So even artists, musicians, regular people could be purged as well. But a lot of the higher echelons or the Red Army generals, they were also victims of those purges. Okay, so we've got just about through the 1930s. So to sum up, we've seen Russia do a crash course of industrialization through a revolutionary program that replaced the autocratic Tsar. I'll leave you with that for today. Thank you so much for joining me.